Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We are joined today by historian Martha S. Jones, who is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. She's the author of All Bound Up Together, The Women Question in African American Public Culture, 1830 to 1900, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2007, and the new book, Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America, just published by Cambridge University Press. How are you doing, Professor Jones?
I'm fine, thank you.
One of the things I found really interesting in reading your book, particularly the early parts of it, is that you actually worked in the law prior to writing this history. You know, these stories that you tell of working with New York City vagrants, the homeless, it really colors some of the things that we see you looking for throughout Birthright Citizens. Talk about how you made that jump from doing legal aid work to now writing what could ostensibly be described as a partial legal history of the African American experience around citizenship.
Yeah, so I'm glad that connection was clear to you, because it is for me, the relationship between that, my own past, and this 19th century past. I was lucky. In the mid-1990s, the Charles Revson Foundation and Columbia University had something called the Charles Revson Fellows on the Future of the City of New York. That's a mouthful, but what it was about was creating sabbatical opportunities for people whose public interest work did not provide for sabbaticals.
Right.
So we were lawyers, we were labor organizers, we were teachers, firefighters, social
Folks
workers.
who don't get that kind of time off, right?
And Columbia and the Revson Foundation gave 10 people a year 1 year off, during which we could do whatever we wanted at Columbia. I applied because I had a kind of amateurish interest in history, and there were two key people. One was Eric Foner, the 19th century US historian, and I wrote to him and said, hey, looks like I'm going to have this opportunity. Could I take your African American history research seminar? And he said, sure. And the other person was the late and very dear Manning Marable. Marable had just arrived at Columbia and was creating the Institute for Research in African American Studies, and I went to see him and I said, you know, I don't know much about academia, but I know a lot about you. And, and I worked for him doing some very preliminary research on what became his Malcolm X book. And so I spent a year with them, and in that realized that I had this itch I wanted to scratch, which was historical research. But it also helped me to appreciate in a deep way how a lot of the questions that I was asking and wrestling with in the real world as a lawyer had historical answers, or needed history as one context for answering them, that the law really was one way to answer them, but not the only way. And you know, the rest, as they say, is a little bit of history. But it brings me here to this book because this is, as you say, my attempt to go back in time to the kinds of places I practice law, to ask what Black folks are doing, what's happening there, and what does it look like there when you ask questions about rights and citizenship.
You recover William Yates, and then you find another William Yates. But let me start with the one that you recover in this great quote from The Rights of Colored Men. Not slaves nor aliens nor the equals of free white men who were former slaves and their descendants before the law. And in some way, this very 19th century question is still a 21st century question.
Absolutely.
It's amazing how your book kind of brings us back around to these basic questions of race and rights. Talk about William Yates and what his work does in this period to really help raise a generation of Black folks to see themselves as legal thinkers.
Absolutely. And that was one of the big questions when I came into this project was, well, how is it that people who are outside of formal training, who are excluded from the bar, who are nearly seemingly excluded from the courthouse,
who might be illiterate,
right? Who perhaps
Right.
can't read, don't
Right.
have access, or don't
To
have
formal
free
literacy,
access
right.
to literacy, but to texts and libraries. How could they actually be a part of the history of law? And it turns out Yates is one of those kinds of figures that's important because he's an abolitionist, but he's a unique sort of abolitionist in the sense that he is more interested, in fact, in questions of civil rights and the rights of former slaves than he is in the anti-slavery project itself. Right. And as a consequence, he spends more time in free black communities than a lot of abolitionists do, and he comes to learn the ways in which in those communities questions about rights, questions about citizenship are right up front for folks. And he does this amazing work, which is the book, Rights of Colored Men, really combing and compiling and pulling together evidence from really a disparate and kind of curious set of places, but that was the nature of the question. And he creates a sort of primer that permits folks over a broad swath of space and time, right, to ask that question in a new way with legal authority, with formal texts, in addition to their own political instincts, right, in addition to their own sort of vernacular approaches to law. Yates gives them this really revered sort of text, which is the legal treatise, except now it wants to speak to their rights, their power, their authority, rather than their denigration, which is what much of legal writing had been up until that point.
I'm sure that when you started working on this book, you wouldn't think that you would be at Johns Hopkins.
No,
when it was. But of course, there's that interesting symmetry about it. Why Baltimore? Why does Baltimore have such a prominence in this story that you tell?
It's true, and I have to back up and say to people, I actually wasn't in Baltimore when I started this book a long time ago, 10 years ago. But Baltimore is ideal for thinking about these questions. It is the largest free African American community in the United States, larger than Philadelphia or New Orleans.
It doesn't seem like folks know that.
No, people don't. So I'm here to.
Baltimore's not one of those cities that you.
Absolutely, third largest city in the United States.
Right.
Before on the eve of the Civil War. Right. So a really important place in that regard. And I was looking for a place where I could see, if you will, in slow motion, the transition from slavery to freedom and how former slaves are working on questions of race and rights. Right. And so that population, right, and its size and its stability over time let me do that.
And you mentioned, folks often think about some place like New Orleans. It's a natural place to look at free blacks, but there's something else going on in Baltimore that makes it unique.
Well, of course, because this is actually a much more modest and less elite community, I would say more representative. Right. This is not a slave-holding black elite. This is not a property-owning black elite. This is a working-class black community. Right. Many people who now, across generations, by the eve of the Civil War, have been working on this stuff. And they sit in this vice between slavery and freedom, right? Maryland is a slave-holding state. Baltimore is a largely free city by 1850. And so they are really, as Barbara Fields once put it, right, the middle ground between slavery and freedom. What I wanted to emphasize is that it's also a port city, which makes it always a sort of cosmopolitan place, because news and people and culture and politics and law is coming in and out of the port of Baltimore in ways that keep Baltimoreans in the mix politically, even when they've been cut off from places like Philadelphia and New York by black laws and violence. They still have access to the world.
And I mean, you mentioned the way that the borders of African American belonging, are different because it's a port city. You have all these seafaring men, right, who get to see the world and bring the world back to Baltimore. So, black Baltimoreans are always seeing more.
Yeah. It's phenomenal.
Than just the confines of the city.
It really is. And, I'm deeply indebted to my former colleague, Julius Scott, who really brings all of our attention to this dynamic. And Scott even writes about one sailor from Baltimore in the late 18th century who kind of moves between Haiti and Maryland in those earlier decades. But Julius's work was really, for me, formative because he insisted that we appreciate the deep substance of what sailors are doing, experiencing, and making possible. So I write about one sailor, George Hackett, who makes this extraordinary voyage from Baltimore to Norfolk, to Veracruz, to Havana, to Rio de Janeiro, and then up the west coast of South America to the Pacific. And then he comes back, right, and figures out what to do with what he's learned after a stint in the Navy, and his story turns out to be key to understanding what I'm trying to do.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by historian Martha S. Jones, the author of the just published Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America, just published by Cambridge University Press. One of the things I liked when you gave this kind of image of the legal consciousness of African Americans in the late 18th, early 19th century, how important the print media was for them. Freedom's Journal being one great example, right? And again, you're talking about a population that is, compared to some of their white peers, not as literate, but they see themselves as legal thinkers. They see themselves as readers, as thinkers. How important was it for them to reach out and develop a network of newspapers and other platforms to be able to tell these stories?
So one of the things I thought I knew everything about Freedom's Journal, published initially in 1827 out of New York City, but it was a paper that I associated with New York, with Boston, with Philadelphia. And then when I looked at that masthead and I realized from the get there were two agents out of Baltimore who were bringing that newspaper to Baltimore, I said, so see what these folks are thinking about. And then you read the initial self-definition, the proclamation, right, that brings Freedom's Journal into being, and it's about law. It is about that journal's mission, including the Constitution, the Declaration, establishing, grappling with, teaching about legal rights as part of the paper's mission from the beginning. So for me, this was new and good news in the sense that it helped me to understand then, again, how folks who were excluded from formal training are indeed training themselves. The other place is the colored convention movement, what we call the colored convention movement. And those conventions, importantly, not only meet in a live debate, they then publish their minutes and they circulate in pamphlet form, they circulate in newspapers. And so these become the ways that folks are training themselves in very serious ways. And if we're not sure, if they're serious, look at what happens to their ideas over time. They become part of the U.S. Constitution, and then we appreciate the import of what's happening in those scenes.
I have a late uncle, Raymond Murray, and I remember talking with him towards his death, and he always talked about how important it was for him to get license. That license to do various things, legitimize him in certain kinds of ways, so that when I read your conversation about how important getting permits, whether it be gun permits or something else, or license to do certain kinds of work, was in fact a performance of a kind of symbolic citizenship for many black folks, particularly free blacks.
Historians have long written about what we call black laws before the Civil War, which regulate things like travel, guns.
Black laws, black codes,
And there is a dimension to those that is indeed a denigration, right? It is meant to mark black folks as other, and it does. But what I discovered were two things. In a city like Baltimore, those laws are rarely enforced. So that's the first thing that I'm curious about. It turns out that custom, in Baltimore is such that rarely are black laws enforced. And still, folks go into the courthouse to get those permits. So what's going on there, right? And you begin to see that there is something essential about community members who do come into these formal settings, who stand up before a judge in front of a public audience, who claim a sort of right. Now, it is not a complete right. It is not a full right. For example, that 1-year gun permit that you get. But guess what? You leave that day with a document signed by a judge, by respectable white men, that you then will put forth when someone challenges you and your gun. And so to appreciate those scenes required kind of going in like close to what was happening in the courthouse in any given day. Black men getting gun permits right alongside white immigrants who are renouncing their allegiances and declaring their intent to become naturalized citizens. There's powerful stuff going on in those local courthouse scenes, and that's what I was after and trying to capture in the book, was the meanings of those powerful scenes.
Were there any things that you came across in your research that just fundamentally surprised you?
Well, there is a day, and part of my work in this book, you know, and I know I'm not the first historian to sit here and wax on about what it's like to go through grubby old boxes full of coal, soot, but there it is. That's what I do, and I love that. And I'm coming through a box, and I'm somebody who loves the miscellaneous box because you just don't know what's going to be there. So there's a miscellaneous box, and it turns out to be travel permit applications. Okay, I'm interested in this, and I'm reading them one by one. And I come across one, a man named Cornelius Thompson, and when I look at the signatories, the 3 respectable white people, the first signature is Roger Brooke Taney, the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, I had expected to find travel permits, and I had a sense of what it would mean for white men generally to be signing on to them. But to see the Supreme Court Chief Justice in this everyday, ordinary, routine scene, for me, demonstrated that there was a connection between what was happening here in this local courthouse and what's happening
federal policy
and the highest court of the land. Now, the funny part of this is that I'm pretty excited, and you know, when you're excited in the archive, you turn to who's ever at the desk. You just begin to talk, and I tell the person at the desk, you know, look at this. It's Roger Taney, and I had been working this archive for weeks, and next thing I know, the state archivist, Edward Poppenfuss, is standing by my desk. Now, I can tell you, Poppenfuss was a great guy. He was very gracious, but he really didn't have a lot of time to come down and talk to researchers. He was a pretty busy person. But there he was, because even for him, the find of Taney was something that we all needed to recognize and think about. And so that's when I knew, you know, I had moved into a new place in the book that I hadn't anticipated. And that still, for me, is a deeply symbolic moment for many people who I think doubt the relationship between African American legal culture, vernacular legal culture, the everydayness of a local courthouse, and what happens at the U.S. Supreme Court. That travel permit for me is my smoking gun, right? That we have to talk about those things in the same discussion.
And let's talk about Taney for a moment, right? His brother's a state legislature, right? So the family business seems to be, in some ways, you know, dealing with this idea of whether or not African Americans have birthright citizenship. And of course, Taney is the one who writes, you know, the decision for Dred Scott. What I thought was really interesting in the way that you describe everyday folks in Baltimore as being aware of Dred Scott, but their lives not being defined by what Dred Scott represented. It seems as though that's an interesting moment because you see a generation of folks who are looking really beyond their moment. Right. If they're going to get birthright citizenship, Dred Scott's just another obstacle in the way.
Absolutely. And we, I think, too often treat Dred Scott as if it is all defining for this question. And partly I write this book because I sense that's not perhaps true. And now I've got to go in and find another story. And it turns out, as you say, that in Baltimore, Dred Scott really changes very little in a day-to-day sense. Now, it is politically and psychically, no doubt, a blow. But folks keep showing up to the courthouse and keep on with this long-standing project, which is about a claim for citizenship that even Dred Scott is not going to get in the way of. And they so much do so that they get traction in Maryland's High Court, when Maryland's High Court the next year, in a case called Hughes versus Jackson, has a chance to, in essence, import or adopt the logic of Dred Scott. Maryland's High Court says, no, actually, free African Americans in this state are not citizens the way white men are, but they have the right to come into court to protect their persons, to protect their property, their wages. And we have no interest in excluding them the way in which Taney has excluded them from federal courts. That's a defining moment for me, and an important one, I think, for those of us who have long thought Dred Scott was the whole story. It turns out there are real limits to Dred Scott. And as I write, Taney knows it. He's deeply disappointed in the reception of Dred Scott.
Taney also takes us to this contemporary moment, because there were, until a year ago, a bunch of memorials to Taney, which brings up, of course, to this moment of thinking about the Robert E. Lee statue that was removed here at Duke. And of course, the conversations here at Duke about the Julian Carr building. Talk about what it was like in Baltimore, and it's great. You have a photo of yourself,
me and Taney, and the before.
You and Taney before. What was the conversation like in a city like Baltimore now around a figure like Taney, who folks might have read in a history book, might know in relationship to studying Dred Scott in high school, but really hadn't thought about, Because it's Baltimore, Why would there be symbols of the Confederacy in Baltimore?
Well, so this is, we could talk about this for a whole hour, but I'll try and keep it brief, because when Taney's likeness was removed, and there were 3 of them removed, one in Baltimore, one in the State House, and one in Frederick, where he had lived as a young man, people said Taney wasn't a Confederate, and he was not, Taney stays on the U.S. Supreme Court. He remains, a functionary a high functionary of the Union until his death in 1864. So why is Taney coming down? Well, it's partly because in Maryland, the debate had preceded the Confederate monument debate, and Taney came down in part because he had been pro-slavery. And so that's part of the key. And Dred Scott is symbolic
his monument,
of that. But it turns out that, though we don't completely know this until we're right in the throes, of taking down the monuments, that Taney's monuments had been placed by William Walters, who people who know Baltimore will know Walters because we have a wonderful fine arts museum that bears his name. But Walters was the Confederate, and who had left Baltimore during the war. He exiled himself. He was so displeased with the states having remained in the Union. He leaves, he goes to Europe, he comes back, and one of his projects, now Taney has died, and one of his projects is to commission these very high quality likenesses of Taney, placing one in Baltimore and then one at the State House. And so they are Confederate monuments in another sense, not because they're monuments to the lost cause, but maybe they are. Taney's image gets appropriated and reappropriated and appropriated again in a state like Maryland for a very long time. And we could say, and he gets reappropriated when he comes down, to evidence the city's enlightened perspective on race in the 21st century, arguably, at least.
How do you come down on some of the debates around, say, Julian Carr here in North Carolina, the Silent Sam protests being, part of that, but here on Duke's campus, where there's a building named after him, there are those folks who say, let's rename the building, Take the name off, rename it. There are those folks who say, why not own that history and the difficulties of that history and make that a part of going forward?
So I have 2 kinds of thoughts. I'm certainly not a historian who believes, for example, that Roger Taney will be forgotten to history because we take down a few monuments. There's no danger of that. Taney is part of our history, and he will not be forgotten even if his image is not there in the town square. So I'm not someone who is opposed, right, to the transformation, the change, the removal, the relocation of monuments. I just don't believe that's where history resides, or history doesn't reside there alone. The lawyer in me is really interested in process. And so one of the things I learned about Baltimore, having arrived there just as the Taney monuments were taken down, was that that was the last chapter in what had been a 2-year-long process convened by the mayor of Baltimore, a commission that did research into the history of the monuments, that convened many, many raucous and important and lively public meetings on the question. That was democracy, right? That was a deliberation that concluded that there were 4 monuments in Baltimore that should be removed. And when the mayor does it in the wake of Charlottesville, it looks like an intemperate moment.
But they
in
were
fact,
ahead of the curve.
It was the end of a very democratic process. And so I'm partly a believer in the process, even as it slows things down, as a vehicle for a kind of historical education. Because what happened for Baltimore over 2 years is that Baltimoreans learned a lot about their history. And that required time, right? And so I think one of the things, if I understand, Silent Sam and that controversy, has been one where there hasn't been a process available. There hasn't been a process constructed by which folks can learn. So a lot of time passes and it's fraught and full of strife, rather than saying, now here's the parameters and here's how we're going to deliberate as a community. And I'm a believer in university communities. And so I think you all, Duke, if I understand some of the what's transpiring around the Carr building, right, is that, is an education, right? That people had to learn who Carr was, and that required some research a few years ago. I think it's Aaron Astor, the graduate student who, unearths a Carr speech and teaches us, some of what we needed to know about Carr.
Bill Sturkey over at UNC, the kind of research that he's done around this.
I think so. So I am in that way a believer that process is more than due process is more than a technical notion. It is a substantive notion about how we as a democracy, how we as communities teach ourselves the things we need to know. Now, the risk of that is that things don't turn out the way I would like them to, but I believe in the education dimension of these, and lament, right, when the issues get reduced to strife, right, to conflict, and don't include a place where people can actually think and learn and deliberate and change their minds. Because I think in Baltimore, people changed their minds when they learned.
We've been joined today by Professor Martha S. Jones, author of the new book, Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America, published by Cambridge University Press. Thank you for joining us in the Left of Black studio, Martha.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black, culture over everything.